The hum of activity surrounded the boarding gate for the early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. Passengers shuffled forward in neat lines, clutching coffee cups and carry-ons, their faces set with a mix of fatigue and purpose. It was a first-class boarding group, and the energy felt both exclusive and restrained. Among them was a man who stood out, not just for his tailored navy suit or the polished leather shoes that gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, but for the way he carried himself. With an air of superiority that seemed to command attention, this man in his mid-40s exuded confidence. He wasn't here to simply fly. He was here to assert his dominance, even among strangers. As he strolled toward the gate, his leather briefcase swinging in perfect rhythm with his steps, he glanced at the passengers around him, with thinly veiled disinterest. Soon, he was comfortably settled in his first-class seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him, the older man who shuffled down the aisle carrying nothing but a small bag. The man wasn't dressed for first class, at least not by the businessman standards. A tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and a pair of worn loafers completed his look. His face, though weathered by time, held a certain calmness, like someone who had seen enough of life to be unaffected by trivialities. The older man moved quietly, settling into his seat with little fuss. He adjusted his jacket, placed his bag under the seat in front of him, and leaned back, gazing out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, a picture of modesty and simplicity, but to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man glanced at him, then at the flight attendant who was helping a few passengers find their seats. With a sly grin, he leaned over just enough to ensure the older man could hear him. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said with a smirk. A few heads turned, subtle reactions from nearby passengers. The older man, however, didn't flinch. He glanced at the businessman briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips, before turning back to the window. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate the businessman. Undeterred, he added, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was sharper this time, laced with condescension. Still, the older man didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response he could have given, and it only fueled the businessman's arrogance. As the plane began to taxi, something about the older man's calm demeanor began to gnaw at the businessman. It wasn't just the silence. It was the quiet confidence, the unshakable sense of self that felt almost out of place in a world where appearances seemed to mean everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let it go. For him, the flight was just beginning, and little did he know, so was a lesson he'd never forget. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its familiar rhythm. The occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But the businessman, seated just a row away from the older man, couldn't let the interaction go. Something about the older man's presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage, felt like a challenge. Though he couldn't quite explain why, he crossed one leg over the other and leaned slightly into the aisle, glancing at the man who continued to stare out the window. "I'm curious," the businessman said, loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear. "What brings someone like you to first class, big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one intervened. The older man didn't react immediately, taking a slow, measured breath before turning slightly toward the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The older man's gaze was steady, unbothered, almost as though he was sizing up the younger man's intentions. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the window, his expression as composed as ever. The lack of reaction only emboldened the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder now, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." He chuckled to himself, his tone making it clear that he thought he'd won whatever imaginary battle he'd conjured. Nearby, passengers began to shift in their seats. A woman in her 50s glanced at the businessman with a look of disapproval, while a young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the older man. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to a man sitting across the aisle, a fellow professional in a pressed suit. "You know," he began, gesturing toward the older man, "people like to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly not wanting to get involved. But the businessman didn't notice, or didn't care. He continued, "They always talk about how things were better, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her professional smile was slightly strained as she reached the older man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said with a warm, respectful tone, "would you like coffee or tea?" The moment the words left her mouth, the businessman froze. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood. His mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The older man turned toward the flight attendant and offered her a polite smile. "Coffee black, please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice, and the face now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose reputation preceded him in every room, every space. And here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's condescension. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" a woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth settled in. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just any older passenger. He was a Hollywood icon, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The gravity of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless. But the realization wasn't the end of his humiliation. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would play out in front of the entire cabin. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood's name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he'd grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a tan jacket who had absorbed his jabs without a single word of protest. He stole another glance at Eastwood, who was now calmly sipping his coffee, seemingly unaware or simply unbothered by the ripple of whispers spreading through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward one another, their murmurs growing louder as the realization dawned on more and more of them. "That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it?" a woman a few rows back said excitedly to her husband. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." "Diz," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's ears burned as the words reached him. He slumped slightly in his seat, wishing he could somehow vanish into the cushions. The quiet conversations around him only magnified his embarrassment, each one like a tiny spotlight, illuminating his foolishness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he mustered the courage to speak. Leaning slightly forward in his seat, He said, "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood." His voice was quiet now, hesitant, a far cry from the loud, arrogant tone he'd used earlier. Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto the businessman's. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look that stopped people in their tracks, a gaze filled with quiet authority and the wisdom of someone who had seen and endured far more than most could imagine. "Yes," Eastwood said simply, his voice steady and calm. The businessman opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What was he supposed to say? Sorry for being an ass? Sorry I didn't recognize you? Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here? None of it felt sufficient. I didn't realize," he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, waiting. His silence only made the businessman's discomfort grow. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, I didn't realize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table in front of him and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I weren't who you think I am?" Eastwood asked, his tone measured but sharp. The businessman blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Eastwood tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" The businessman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that was the answer he'd expected all along. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back toward the window, signaling that for him the conversation was over. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson Eastwood had just delivered, calmly, succinctly, and with more impact than any raised voice or angry retort ever could, hung heavy in the air, and there was no escaping it. As the flight continued, the businessman remained silent, his thoughts churning with a mix of regret and introspection. He replayed not just this interaction but others, moments from his life where he'd been quick to judge, quick to dismiss. He thought about the intern he'd once ridiculed for suggesting an idea he deemed too inexperienced to understand. Months later, that same idea became a cornerstone of the company's success, though it was credited to someone else. He thought about the janitor at his office, whom he'd never bothered to greet until the day that man stopped to help him pick up scattered papers after he'd tripped in the hallway. He thought about colleagues whose opinions he brushed aside, neighbors whose names he didn't know, strangers whose stories he never cared to hear. Each memory added to the weight in his chest, a growing realization of how his arrogance and assumptions had shaped his interactions with others. He had built a life on success and status, priding himself on being a self-made man. Yet here he was, being schooled on the most basic principle of decency by someone he had so carelessly dismissed. The plane descended into Los Angeles. The businessman felt a familiar jolt as the landing gear deployed.